welcome to BloombergQuint. India's export performance has been a story of many targets and much debate over the years. But most would agree that India needs to up its game on export growth and its share of global exports. Among other reasons, this is important to push up domestic growth as well. A high-level advisory committee which submitted its report yesterday has looked at both macro and micro aspects of India's export performance. Joining us to talk about some of the key takeaways is Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and Professor Pulak Ghosh of IIM Bangalore. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak to us here on BloombergQuint. Mr. Sanyal, let me start with you. I think it was interesting to see both the macro aspects and the micro aspects discussed in this very extensive report. My first question to you is this, and this is backward looking before we go forward looking. As the report itself puts out in its data, there was a marked deterioration in India's export performance, at least going by rankings, between 2012 and 17. To your judgment, is this a factor of the macro factors, such as real interest rates, etc., which you talk about, or was this a combination of both inadequate policy planning at the micro level and macro aspects?
Well, you can do a post-mortem as you wish, but it's usually impossible to strip out separate, factors. Since 2012, as you know, we have several factors that fed into each other. One is, of course, that global export growth significantly slowed down as well. But India's own performance would have been also affected by domestic factors. I mean, real interest rates have been high. There is a discussion in there, as you know, about the tax architecture of the country and many other issues as well. So what we have tried to do here is build out another block of the overall sort of strategy that goes into creating this $5 trillion target that Prime Minister Modi has talked about. So if you saw the economic survey, I'm an author of that, as one of the authors of that as well. And in this, where I'm a member of this group, in both of them, a very similar philosophy is being propagated, which is that if you want to grow at 8% type growth rates over a sustained period of time, then the overwhelming evidence is you have to have an export and investment-led growth strategy. And so there are many elements of that. Now, one element of that is dealt with in this report that I have here with me, and that is about the export part of it. Of course, some parts of it are common with the other legs of this strategy. But basically what it says, you have to get your tax architecture correct. You have to lower the cost of capital. You have to be willing to engage with the world and participate in global trade, because you can't have investment-led growth if you don't have an export strategy. And of course, then there are specific high-end sectors that you want to be aware of and already beginning to move into that. There are a whole bunch of elements that need to go into this, and the idea here is to put it in one place.
All right, and I'll get into some of those elements. Professor Ghosh, if I can ask you, so at this point in time, as Mr. Sanyal was saying, there is a $5 trillion economy target that we are working towards. There has also been a long-standing target of pushing up manufacturing as a share of GDP, and I know that exports you deal with is not just goods. You also talk about services and agriculture, but there is the attempt to push up manufacturing from a jobs perspective as well. Is there a realization, at least within the committee and then hopefully via the committee in the broader administration, that at this stage we need to make a major push on exports, along with, of course, the home market and repairing some of the problems there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as Sanjeev was saying, the committee has taken all these things very carefully. And particularly manufacturing is, initially we missed the bus. And if we have to go to the $5 trillion economy, that's a bigger bus which we have to take care. And with the upcoming AI and all those innovation, we have to make very careful judgment on the export front also, that how we utilize our demographic dividend in manufacturing and build pipeline in export.
Mr. Sanyal, you talk about the macro aspects and you lay down some of the conditions. So actually, firstly, it was good to see that the exchange rate debate has been put to rest by this committee. We've seen many times in the past the exchange rate being blamed for India's export performance. You say that's not a factor, but real interest rates, labor legislation certainly are. Now, these are very onerous sort of changes to make at a macro level. Like labor reforms are not going to be driven only by exports. Real interest rates are not going to be driven only by an exports consideration. But it's very clear to you that those are sort of necessary conditions to push up exports?
Yes, the idea was to have absolute clarity of thought as far as what needs to be done, because many things are said, you get a suggestion every day. So the idea was to go through all these ideas and make sure that we are clear about what we want. What we found is that the exchange rate in itself is a difficult tool to use actively. Our traditional way is to simply allow the exchange rate to adjust itself according to market forces and maybe use the reserves to stop excessive movements in either way. And I think by and large what we have discovered that this seems to be a perfectly reasonable way to manage our exchange rate, because it is not an active tool we can use. It can be passively allowed to adjust to overall global conditions, which I think this report basically argues is the reasonable way to go about it into the future. So what is it that we can do actively? Actively lower the cost of capital, actively change the tax structure, actively look at things like labor laws and so on, actively, if necessary, target certain sectors where we think we have competence and can build clusters, look at things like logistics seriously. So the idea here is to have clarity on thought of what we need to do in a world where we get all kinds of suggestions, every day. So the idea of this is that we know what we need to do now, and we go about ticking them. And incidentally, the draft of this report has already led to a lot of discussion inside the government. One of its key recommendations, which was on corporate tax rates, is already is getting implemented, as you know. So we take this whole thing quite seriously.
I think the point that I was making, or the question that I was asking, and I'll reframe it for Professor Ghosh, is that, yes, in an ideal world, we want low real interest rates, we want labor legislations to be eased, and all of that supports, growth domestically and in the export sector. But can that export growth be achieved if one focuses on some of the micro suggestions that the committee has made, even if some of these big picture macro things don't immediately get addressed? Because it would be a little optimistic to say that in one year cycle we'll see labor legislations ease, real interest rates below 1%. All of that is hope, right?
See, in this case, basically, the committee looked at two-pronged strategy, which should be the case. One is things which definitely has to be done. It may take time, but it has to be done, and in a long run, those fundamental structural, reforms we have to take at some time point. So labor law, something which is in that direction, which for long pending, and I'm happy that the government is already doing it. The committee has suggested. Corporate tax rate is another one. We are already seeing some FII movement along that direction because of corporate tax reduction. And there are some other things which are more local and more quick fixes we can do. So that is one angle in my contribution in the report, was bringing data to understand what are the issues related to export and which can be fixed much faster and much more real time. Looking at several conditions can be used also. So basically, it's always two-pronged approach the committee has taken, which can be fixed quickly and which is needed, although long-term has to be done.
On that point of data, Mr. Sanyal, if I can come to you, so I think this whole US-China trade tension, had people believed that it had left room open, and now people believe that the only country which has truly benefited, at least so far, early days yet, is perhaps Vietnam. Maybe that's where data comes in, right? One looks at supply chains, as the committee has pointed out, and one finds out which sectors, which segments, which markets one needs to attack, rather than, be the traditional way of saying, okay, textiles is a good sector to track, or electronics is a good sector to track. So perhaps a data-driven approach towards where one needs to attack the export market.
I think it's not just about an evidence-based approach, which is obviously important, as Pulak pointed out, but also to recognize that we live in a dynamic world where just because an opportunity pops up because of a trade war, it doesn't mean that we have some God-given right to insert ourselves into it. Other countries exist, they move, change their policies, and our competitors will move faster than us if we don't take care. So I think one of the things we have tried to do is to give a feeling that, look, this is a dynamic world and we need to participate in it dynamically by keeping continuous feedback loops to see what the rest of the world is doing and what we need to do better.
Okay. Where do trade talks, trade agreements fall into this? Mr. Sanyal, if I could stay with you on that. It's sort of an immediate issue right now with the RCEP being discussed. The committee seems to suggest that India stands to benefit more rather than lose from participating in these agreements.
Obviously, I can't comment on specific negotiations that are currently ongoing. But as a general principle, the point that this report makes is this, that we live, again, as I said, in a dynamic world. Our options is either we participate or get left out. So not only is it the case that, that we will not be a part of certain kinds of supply chains, discussions, etc., if we do not participate, it is also the case that when you think of, for example, of a supply chain, that supply chain is not merely going to be created for that trading group, RCEP, or whatever it happens to be. That supply chain, once established, is also going to export to third party, because the same supply chain, the same factories and so on. There are many important components in the world which are just happen to be, for the whole world, are produced in one or two factories. Now, if you're not part of the chain, you're not a part of the chain at all. So, our best option is to participate in it. Now, ideally, we would like a multilateral world, WTO, and so on. But that is while that gets arranged and hopefully will work out, that multilateral world may not exist. So in that case, we need to participate in these blocks, and our best option is to participate in it in some way in which we can influence those in some fashion and be a part of the story rather than be left behind.
Professor Ghosh, if I can ask you that question as well. I know Mr. Sanyal, being a part of the government, would need to be careful on what position he takes on this. But theoretically, a construct like RCEP, do you think India cannot afford to stay out of it? Obviously, try to get the best deal out of it, but would need to be a part of it?
Yeah, I completely agree that we cannot be left ourselves out of this because we can be singled out. So we have to be there. But given our, our capability, our power, and our market, I think government is probably in the right direction. I don't know the details. That while we have to be there, we have to figure out our own advantage and modalities and under what condition it is beneficial for us. So that's the key part. I don't think that staying out is an option anymore. But under what conditions and what kind of leverages we get out of it is probably what is needed to be considered.
Mr. Sanyal, how should one change or adjust our approach to tariffs as well? Again, in a fairly tense world where countries may be, given to raising tariffs here and there, does one be reactive, or does one have a pre-charted path on where one wants to see tariffs go and stick to that, and not be given into immediate reactions to one country saying we're raising tariffs and hence we must react?
I mean, it's the same principle that we have in terms of whether we participate or not in trade blocs, which is that we must protect our national interests. There's no question about that. Now, obviously, the national interest is not merely served by creating high tariff walls. If that was the case, then the pre-1991 world would have been the most successful. We have to take into account the fact that there are trade-offs we have to make. And those trade-offs, when we may have to, certain segments inside the country may hurt, some segments may gain. So some of the political economy internally in terms of the trade-offs, the winners and losers, how we compensate one for the other, how we open out things in a reasonable sequence, and in some cases there may be, we may need time for adjustment. So as I said, the best option is to negotiate a deal which works for us and makes the best possible trade-off. Now, it is not the case that everything that will work the way we want it, but the idea here is that if we negotiate hard and are able to get a reasonably good deal, we will on the whole benefit.
But the committee does recommend that the tariff structure outside of these issues needs to be rationalized and the upper end needs to be brought down, say, over a 5-6 year period, sir?
So I don't want to comment specifically. As I said, there are many negotiations which are on, which are live, and I am not in a position to comment on them. But as a general principle, we want a world which is open and does trade, with obviously certain areas where we may have national interests, where we will take exceptional views of things.
All right. Let me move into some of the micro aspects. And, Professor Ghosh, if I can come to you on agricultural exports. This is an area where one can actually potentially do a lot more, right? Starting with, like you talked about, the structures within the agricultural domestic market, but also moving away from this stop and start export policy that we've had in agriculture. We need to have a proper policy which can then be communicated to the world and say that, okay, in these commodities, we want to push agricultural exports.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the uncertainty right now is too much, and that affects both the agriculture as well as the outside market. But that is how the structure is. So definitely, I think the recommendation has been that some amount of certainty has to be brought in. Now, the modalities and the detail has to be worked out based on that recommendation, that exactly which commodities can have those certainty in terms of continuous export agreement fulfilled. And that also has repercussions in the domestic market and the kind of crop or products that say the agriculture, the farmers are willing to. Because right now there is no such arrangement where every year the farmer are guaranteed to produce the same kind of products in the same rate, and other uncertainties are there. But definitely the uncertainty in the export market on this creates trouble, and that affects in the price also. So that needs to be worked out, but I think that was the recommendation. But how and exactly which kind of product needs to be under that, that needs to be worked out, I guess.
But Professor Ghosh, from your impression and your study of the agricultural export segment, where would we benefit? What are the segments that we can actually actively sort of promote from an export perspective?
So the existing, I don't know much about it as much, but from the existing products which get exported, I think it again vary a lot based on the domestic production. So like, for example, let's take tomatoes, right? Or sugar. Now, there are tomatoes and all those based on it all depends on the domestic market feeding. And when the domestic production doesn't happen as much as expected, then the price in the domestic market goes up and immediately government has to curtail the export. So some of the daily products may be kept out of this loop, and some other where the domestic demand is not so variable over the year, maybe looked at more carefully.
Mr. Sanyal, if I can come to you on services, and I'm deliberately keeping manufacturing for the end. On services, there are some interesting suggestions on areas that can be pushed beyond IT, whether it's financial services, some interesting suggestions coming in there, whether it's healthcare. Do you want to take us to why you think services can be another and a separate sort of focus of exports?
So there are certain segments, like, for example, software, where we have done traditionally reasonably well. But the structure for many other services is we have not been very, very positive. And I'll give you one example, which is, for example, the financial services and fund management industry, where we have had this mindset that round-tripping is such a major problem that, in fact, we have created regulations and tax structures that effectively have exported large parts of this sector abroad. Now, clearly, we don't benefit from it. We are not collecting taxes from them. nor are we able to regulate them in the way we would be if they were actually onshore. So this is an area which we have highlighted very clearly. There are obviously concerns about round tripping, but then as the report itself says, the fear of a traffic accident does not mean that you don't build the highway. So we need to get out of that mindset and be able to create a framework, whether it's tax or regulatory, which allows this segment to come onshore. There is a very lucrative sector, and it creates jobs, high-end jobs. And so we need to think about it. And of course, we are doing this in two ways. One is those who continue to want, despite onshoring, to remain outside our regulatory environment. We are in the process of creating Gift City, as you know. But then there may be many segments where they want to completely onshore. So all of these issues, whether it is Section 9A of the Income Tax Act and others, should be relooked at. We need to be proactive in going out there rather than spend all our energy in trying to somehow avoid an accident on the highway.
Right. No, those are interesting suggestions for sure. On to manufacturing then. Professor Ghosh, or merchandise more broadly. Now, in that segment, one tends to believe that things like cost of capital, the labor laws issue would have a very direct bearing on our ability to actually push up that segment. But do you think that even with the current scenario, assuming that it doesn't change in the near term, there are certain segments such as electronics or textiles, etc., where we can devise special policies to push up those sectors?
So manufacturing in general, especially the mass scaling like garment or electronics, in general, apart from labor laws and cost of capital, another big danger is the increasing use of robotics and AI. So I guess that reduces to some extent the pricing also. So these are probably in manufacturing, we need to take each sector separately. There is a certain aspect of each sector which is a little different. So if you go to the garment, for example, the AI is hitting more than if you go to the electronics. So we need some amount of different treatment in the manufacturing, although the overall structuring like cost of capital, labor, and other generic things are, has to be looked at carefully to incentivize manufacturing. But there are specific sectors where, particularly I'm worried about the AI coming in and hurting us is a little troublesome.
And we also have to look to a forward world, as you were saying, right, Mr. Sanyal? We can't hope to or want to do low-end textiles at this point in time. We probably need to be also moving up the value chain where skill development, etc., comes into play. So those policies, along with capital and labor laws, etc., would be important for manufacturing as an export sort of push.
Absolutely, and I'll just have a slight difference of opinion with Pulak on this. I think, the fact is that AI and robotics exists. We can't wish it away. We have to participate in that world. And in fact, bringing in many of these things and participating at the cutting edge of technology is important because there are many spin-offs from this. The robots themselves have to be built. The software for that robots has to be put in place. And many of these things, I'm not a great believer in the Luddite way of thinking that just because some machine does something, it doesn't create jobs. Every technological progress has actually created more jobs that it has destroyed. In fact, if anything, we have an advantage because many of the legacy industries in India do not even exist. So we can actually leapfrog directly into the universe of robotics and AI and so on, and let us begin manufacturing in those sectors, and create capacities there. Each one of these things, even with a robotics, you need to, you will need people to build the factories, to ship things in, ship things out, think about marketing them, think about advertising. As I said, you still need to feed in design and software. Each one of these things will create jobs. We have got to participate at the cutting edge, and rather than only keep saying, oh, we wish we had done this 30 years ago. That is done and dusted. We can't now go back.
So, Mr. Sanyal, I mean, the committee obviously has a list of sectors and sector-specific recommendations, but to your mind, as having studied the export economy now, what are the sectors in manufacturing where you think we can make a relatively quick difference?
So, yeah, I just want to...
The idea here is, while we have given some... Yeah, sorry, Pulak.
Go ahead, Mr. Sanyal. Let me ask you first. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so the point here is that we have obviously given a list of things that we can do, textiles and other things. But I think the key point being made here is that, number one, there are a whole bunch of things that any and every manufacturing sector needs, which we already mentioned, whether it's labor laws, a cheaper cost of capital, or very importantly, logistics, which is a serious issue, and an issue that we have dealt with not so much here, but in the economic survey, which is the issue about enforcement of contracts and legal reform. So all of these are major ingredients in having a strategy which is outward oriented and export oriented, which we need to get our act together. And by the way, many of the great manufacturing sectors of the future still do not exist today. I mean, what will be great sectors in 10 years' time is unknown. We have to have in place an entrepreneurial culture where we need to create the skill sets and the flexibility to be able to do all these things. So I think the most important thing, if you read the report, you will find is the most important thing that we have argued for is a mindset change. That we need to be out there engaging with the world, looking at the latest technologies, and rather than be afraid of them, to embrace them.
No, that point is taken. Before I run out of time, I have two last questions. But Professor Ghosh, you were saying something. I interrupted you if you wanted to come in on the manufacturing.
I was just saying that, Sanjeev, this is exactly what I meant, that AI and robotics is coming in a very heavy way in manufacturing. And my point, what I was making, that troubles me in the way because we have to embrace it much faster. And one big area there is, there is a huge scope of skilling and skill set export also. So that's the point I was making.
All right. Mr. Sanyal, interesting suggestion.
Fair enough. I agree.
All right. Mr. Sanyal, the suggestion of elephant bonds, that is more a story about the bigger investment story that India needs to build out in the savings investment gap rather than something specific to exports, isn't it?
No, it is not. It's not it's an additional suggestion. Okay. That's really about how an additional way of raising funds for infrastructure. It's not central to what the message of the report is, but yes, it's an idea we have thrown in there for consideration.
All right. So then I'll close it off by asking you all, without wanting to slip back into the old habit of targets. But Professor Ghosh, you do talk about the fact that there is a possibility that we can grow at about 10% per annum on exports and hence double every 7 years, assuming we increase our elasticity to world exports. That is, given the recent performance, still a lofty target, no?
Well, I mean, the recent performance is for various reasons, and there are some slow signal also coming on the revival of it. So I'm hopeful about it.
Mr. Sanyal, last word to you then. Both world trade, given the weak outlook for world trade, and the issues we've seen in India over the last few years, you still willing to stick your neck out on the 10% growth number?
I think it can be done for multiple reasons. First of all, just because growth is slowing right now doesn't mean that it'll remain here forever. This is a longer term strategy. But more importantly, we have to remember that we are just 2% of world trade. We can certainly expand. We need to aspire to expand our share in world trade. In these few years, while world trade was slow, everybody from Vietnam to Bangladesh has increased their shares. We too should aspire to doing these things. And in fact, if we are in the game, if and when world growth begins to accelerate, we will be already in momentum and able to accelerate faster. So we need to get our act together rather than sit around waiting for world trade to simply lift every ship, every boat along the way and lift us as well. We have to be proactive about the whole thing.
All right, no arguing with that. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak to us on the committee report which got presented this week. Thanks so much for watching BloombergQuint. Do go on to the website to see this discussion and also read more about the issue. Thanks for watching.